in the year 1700, if you were born in colonial America, you had roughly a 50-50 chance of seeing your 10th birthday. If you were a woman, pregnancy might kill you. If you were a man, a simple cut could end you in 3 days. And yet, they built a civilization, not in spite of these odds, but by solving them, one brilliant, brutal solution at a time. So, let's go there. Right now, it's just before dawn on a morning in 1710. You're waking up in a one-room house in Massachusetts. The first thing you notice isn't the cold, though it's freezing. It's not the darkness, though sunrise is still an hour away. It's the fire, or rather, what's left of it. Because, if those embers have died completely overnight, your family might not eat today. And that single fact, that dying fire, will show you everything about how colonial Americans actually survived. The woman of the house is already awake. She's been awake for 10 minutes, lying still in the darkness, listening for the sound that tells her whether the fire still lives. A faint crackle, the whisper of settling coals. If she hears nothing, she'll have to walk half a mile to the nearest neighbor to borrow live coals in January before BR. Fast. She rises and moves toward the hearth with practiced silence. Her bare feet know every plank in this floor, every spot that cracks, every nail head that protrudes. In the absolute darkness before dawn, she navigates by memory and touch. This isn't remarkable to her. This is Tuesday. At the hearth, she kneels and reaches carefully into the ash. The technique her mother taught her, and her mother's mother before that. You don't dig frantically. You move slowly, feeling for warmth. Your fingers are your instruments. Too fast, and you scatter the coals. Too slow, and you waste time while your family sleeps in a house growing colder by the minute. There, a glow beneath the ash, red, faint, but alive. She exhales, a breath she didn't know she was holding. The fire lives! Now comes the art. She feeds it carefully. Not wood, not yet. First, the smallest kindling, splinters of pine dry as bone, that she prepared yesterday specifically for this moment. She places them precisely, creating structure, channels for air, space for heat to build. This is architecture in miniature. She's building a fire the way her husband builds a barn. Everything in its right place, everything serving a purpose. OS, a breath of air, gentle, directed. The ember catches a tiny flame. She adds more kindling, slightly larger pieces now, building the structure upward. Only when the flames are strong and steady does she add real wood, oak, split to the right thickness. Not too thick, it won't catch. Not too thin, it'll burn too fast. This entire process takes her 15 minutes. 15 minutes of focused, skilled work performed in near total darkness to accomplish something you now do by turning a dial or flipping a switch. But here's what matters. She never fails. Not once in the 20 years she's been managing this fire has she let it die completely. Because the cost of failure isn't inconvenience, it's hunger, it's cold, it's potentially death. This is what survival looked like in colonial America. Not dramatic, not heroic in the way we usually imagine, just relentless competence at small, crucial tasks. The fire is growing now, pushing back the darkness, creating a sphere of warmth and light in the center of the room. You can see your surroundings for the first time, and what you see is a machine, not made of metal and gears, but of wood and mud and human intelligence. This house is a survival machine, and every single element of it represents a problem that someone solved. Start with the walls around you. They're not flat and smooth like modern walls. Run your hand along one, and you feel texture, irregularity, the clear evidence of human hands at work. These walls are whole and daub, a technique so old that the Romans used it, but that doesn't make it primitive. It makes it proven. Here's how it works. First, you build a wooden frame from timber you've cut yourself. Oak, usually beams 8 inches thick that you've shaped with a broad axe, one careful stroke at a time. These beams are joined together with mortise and tenon joints, pieces that fit together like a three-dimensional puzzle, held in place by wooden pegs. No nails. Nails are expensive. Nails are metal. Metal means a blacksmith. And blacksmith work costs money that most families simply don't have. Between these heavy timber beams, you weave a basket. Literally. You take thin wooden strips. Willow is ideal, but any flexible wood works. And you weave them vertically between horizontal supports. Over, under, over, under. When you're done, you have a lattice of woven wood filling the space between your timber frame. Now comes the day. Orb. This is where people from our time usually recoil because the recipe sounds primitive, even disgusting. But watch what happens when you understand the chemistry. You take clay from the nearest deposit, not just any clay. You need clay with the right amount of plasticity, the right mineral composition. Colonial builders knew how to test this. They'd roll the clay into a ball and let it dry. If it cracked too much sand. If it stayed too soft, not enough sand. They didn't know the words particle size distribution, but they understood the concept perfectly. To this clay, you add water until you get the right consistency. Then comes the straw, chopped small, mixed throughout. The straw does what rebar does in concrete. It provides tensile strength. Clay is strong in compression but cracks under tension. Straw fibers bridge those cracks, holding everything together. And yes, you add manure, usually cow manure, though horse works too.
Why?
Because partially digested plant matter contains enzymes and bacteria that continue to break down the straw, creating a kind of biological binding process. And because the ammonia in manure acts as a mild pesticide, discouraging insects from burrowing into your walls. You plaster this mixture over your woven lattice, packing it in from both sides until you've created a wall 6 inches thick. Then you let it dry. As it dries, something remarkable happens. The clay particles bind together. The straw creates a fibrous matrix throughout. The result is a wall that's surprisingly strong, surprisingly good at insulation, and completely waterproof when properly maintained. How good is the insulation? Better than you'd think. That 6-inch thick wall has an R value. That's the measure of thermal resistance of about R1.5 per inch. Your modern house probably has R13 in the walls. So, this colonial wall is giving you roughly 9 rand. That's not great by modern standards, but it's far better than a single layer of wood planks would give you. And here's the genius of it. Every material in these walls came from within walking distance. The timber from the forest you're clearing anyway to create farmland. The clay from a deposit you found while digging your well. The straw from your own grain harvest. The manure from your livestock. The total cash cost of these walls, 0. The labor cost, high. But labor is the one thing colonial families have in abundance. Look up at the ceiling. Those exposed beams aren't decorative. They're structural, and they tell you exactly how this house was built. You can see the axe marks where each beam was shaped, flat on 4 sides, but not smooth. Smooth takes time, and time is a resource you spend carefully. The roof above those beams is thatch, bundles of straw layered in overlapping rows, starting from the bottom and working up. Each bundle is tied to the roof frame with rope made from twisted plant fibers. The angle of the roof is crucial. Too shallow and water doesn't run off. Too steep, and you waste materials building higher walls. 45 degrees. That's the magic angle thatch has discovered through centuries of trial and error. At 45 degrees, water runs off before it can soak through. Snow slides off before it can accumulate to dangerous weight. And you use the minimum amount of material to cover the maximum amount of space. A well-made thatched roof is waterproof, completely waterproof. Stand inside during a rainstorm and you'll stay dry. The secret is in the density of the thatch and the overlapping pattern. Each bundle overlaps the one below it by 2/3 of its length. Water hits the top surface and ns down the outside of each layer, never penetrating to the inner surface. How long does a thatched roof last? About 25 years if properly maintained. Maintenance means inspecting it twice a year and replacing damaged sections before leaks start. It means keeping birds from nesting in it and pulling out any plants that try to grow in it. It means understanding that your roof is not a permanent installation. It's a living system that requires attention. The floor beneath your feet is packed earth. Not because the family couldn't afford wood planks, though they probably couldn't, but because earth floors have advantages that might surprise you. They're naturally level. You pound them until they're smooth and hard as concrete. They don't rot like wood. They don't harbor insects the way wood does, and they maintain a steady temperature, neither heating up in summer nor getting as cold in winter as wood floors would. The disadvantage: moisture. In heavy rain, groundwater can seep up through an earth floor. The solution: you build your house on a slight rise, if possible, and you dig drainage channels around the perimeter to direct water away. Site selection wasn't random. Colonial builders knew to look at how water moved across land during storms, where snow melted first in spring, where frost came latest in fall. Now, look at the windows. There are 2 of them in this single room, and they're tiny, maybe 18 in square. Why so small? Glass, obviously, is expensive, but there's more to it than cost. Heat loss through windows is tremendous. Glass has almost no insulating value. A large window is basically a hole in your thermal envelope, so you balance the need for light against the need for heat retention. These small windows represent that calculation made visible. But even these small windows don't have glass. Glass windows in 1710 colonial Massachusetts would cost more than the entire rest of the house. Instead, these windows have oiled paper. You take heavy paper, coat it thoroughly with linseed oil, and let it dry. The oil makes the paper translucent and water-resistant. It lets light through, not a lot, but enough to work by during the day, and it can be replaced cheaply when it tears or degrades. Some families use scraped animal horn instead. You take a cow horn, boil it until you can separate it into thin layers, then scrape those layers until they're translucent. Horn windows are more durable than oiled paper and actually let through more light, but they require more skill to make and more time to prepare. Both solutions are temporary compromises. Everyone knows that glass windows are better. Glass is the dream. But dreams have costs, and in colonial America, you make careful calculations about which dreams to pursue and which to defer. The door is solid oak, 3 inches thick, hung on hand-forged iron hinges that probably cost a week's wages. It fits well enough to keep out most drafts, but not perfectly. You can feel cold air sneaking in around the edges on winter mornings. Later today, someone will stuff those gaps with rags or clay or twisted grass. Temporary weather stripping that needs to be replaced seasonally. There's a wooden latch on the inside and a string that runs through a hole to work the latch from outside. At night, you pull the string inside. That's where the phrase "latch string is out" comes from. It means you're welcoming visitors. Pull it in, and visitors know you're either not home or not receiving. The furniture in this room is minimal but purposeful. A table made from thick planks set on trestle legs, benches instead of chairs. Benches are simpler to make and seat more people. A chest for storing clothes and valuables, with a lock if the family can afford one. The bed we mentioned earlier, hide with its rope frame and straw mattress. That rope bed requires maintenance you wouldn't expect. The ropes stretch with use and need to be tightened regularly. There's a special tool for this, a bed wrench that hooks onto the ropes and lets you crank them tight again. When someone says they'll sleep tight, they're referring to this literal tightening of bed ropes. Loose ropes mean a sagging, uncomfortable bed. Tight ropes mean better support and better sleep. Everything in this room serves multiple purposes. The table is for eating but also for food preparation, for working by candlelight in the evening, for laying out fabric to cut for sewing. The benches are for sitting, but also for standing on to reach things hung from the ceiling beams, dried herbs, preserved meat, tools stored out of the way. The chest is for storage, yes, but a good chest is also a display of craftsmanship and a store of wealth. A well-made chest might be passed down through generations, accumulating value not just as furniture, but tea as an heirloom, a symbol of family continuity. And everything is made by hand. The table, someone cut down a tree, split the log into planks, smoothed those planks with a plane, joined them together. Hours and hours of work. The chest, carefully fitted joints, hand-cut dovetails, a hinged lid that required precise carpentry, the bed frame, mortise and tenon joints holding everything together, rope holes drilled at exact intervals. When you live in this room, you're surrounded by human labor, made visible. There's no hiding the fact that every object you use, every surface you touch, represents someone's time and skill and effort. This creates a relationship with objects that modern people rarely experience. You don't throw away a broken tool. You repair it because making a new one might take days. You don't replace furniture because you're bored with it. You use it until it literally falls apart, then salvage the good pieces to repair other items. This isn't sentimentality, it's economics. In a world where everything must be made by hand, waste is unaffordable. The fire is burning strongly now, pushing real warmth into the room. The woman who built it up is already at work. K on the next task, breakfast. She fills an iron pot with water from the bucket that was filled yesterday, adds cornmeal from the sack in the corner, hangs the pot on the iron crane that swings over the fire. That crane is a small marvel of engineering. It's made by the local blacksmith from iron that was probably shipped from England at considerable expense. The crane pivots on a pin, allowing you to swing pots in and out of the fire without reaching directly over the flames. The pin and socket are designed to last decades under daily use. Good blacksmith work is expensive, but it's worth it because the alternative, reaching over an open fire multiple times a day, means inevitable burns and potential disasters. While the porridge cooks, she prepares the rest of breakfast. This might include bread left from yesterday, or cornbread if there's time to make it. Possibly some preserved meat, salt pork sliced thin and fried in its own fat. If the chickens are laying well, maybe eggs. Every item of food represents a chain of labor and planning. The corn in that porridge. Someone planted it last spring, tended it all summer, harvested it in fall, dried it thoroughly, stored it where mice couldn't get to it, then shelled it and ground it into meal using either a hand mill or by pounding it in a mortar. That's months of work to produce what you're eating in 10 minutes. The salt pork. That pig was raised from a piglet, fed scraps, and foraged for months until it reached slaughter weight, killed and butchered in late fall when the weather was cold enough to keep the meat from spoiling. Packed in salt, that was purchased at considerable expense from a merchant who imported it from the coast. The salt packing process required precise knowledge of ratios. Too little salt, and the meat spoils. Too much, and you waste expensive salt, and the meat becomes unpalatable. The bread, grain grown in the field, harvested by hand, threshed to separate the grain from the chaff, ground into flour, mixed with water, and a bit of leavening saved from the last batch, kneaded until the gluten develops properly, shaped and baked in an oven that had to be heated to exactly the right temperature by burning wood inside it, then scraping out the coals. Nothing you eat is simple. Nothing you eat is guaranteed. Every meal is the result of a successful chain of production, preservation, and preparation. N1 broken link, crop failure, spoilage, fire, theft, and the chain fails. This is why colonial families are so focused on food, not because they're glutton or obsessed with eating, but because food security is survival. The difference between having enough and not having enough is the difference between living and dying. There's no grocery store to fall back on, no food bank, no emergency services. Your family's survival depends entirely on the food you've grown, preserved, and stored. As the morning light starts to filter through those small windows, turning the darkness to gray, and then to dim illumination, you can see the full scope of this one-room world. It's small, it's simple, by modern standards. It's primitive, but it's the result of enormous intelligence accumulated over generations applied to the problem of survival. Every element of this house represents a question that had to be answered. How do you keep heat in? How do you keep water out? How do you create light without electricity? How do you store food without refrigeration? How do you make furniture without power tools? How do you build walls without hardware stores? The answers are all around you, not perfect answers. No one would claim that whole and double ORB is better than modern insulation, or that oiled paper windows are preferable to double pane glass. But these are answers that work. Proven answers. Answers that kept families alive through centuries of New England winters. And the knowledge required to implement these answers that was passed down parent to child, master to apprentice, neighbor to neighbor. No instruction manuals, no YouTube tutorials, just observation, practice, and the understanding that failure to learn these skills could mean death. The sun is rising fully now. Time to step outside and see what the day holds. Time to understand how this house, this survival machine, fits into the larger systems that kept colonial communities alive. Now, let's step outside and experience the life. The door opens and cold air rushes in, sharp enough to make you catch your breath. Step outside, and the first thing you notice is the landscape. It doesn't look like farmland in the way you might imagine. It looks like a battlefield between humans and forest. And in a very real sense, that's exactly what it is. Stumps, everywhere you look, stumps, massive tree stumps, some of them 4 feet across, jutting up from the ground like broken teeth. These are the ghosts of the forest that stood here 20 years ago. Old-growth oak, pine, chestnut, trees that had been growing for centuries before the first European settlers arrived. Cutting down these trees was hard work, but it was nothing compared to removing the stumps. A full-grown oak has a root system that extends outward as far as the tree is tall and down into the earth, deeper than you can easily dig. Removing one stump completely might take 3 men a full week of brutal labor, digging, chopping roots, leveraging with poles, eventually burning what they can't dig out, so they don't bother. They cut the trees, use the timber for building or firewood, and plant around the stumps. Over decades, the stumps will rot. In the meantime, you work around them. This is pragmatism in its purest form. Allocate your labor where it produces the most value. A week spent removing a stump is a week not spent planting crops, building fences, or doing any of the 1,000 other tasks that keep a family alive. Between the stumps, you see the fields. These aren't the neat rectangular plots of modern agriculture. There are regular shapes following. The contours of the land, avoiding rocky outcrops. Working around the stumps, but look closer and you'll see intelligence at work. The corn is planted in small mounds, each mound about 3 feet from the next. This spacing isn't random, it's calculated. Too close together and the plants compete for nutrients and sunlight. Too far apart and you're wasting land. 3 feet is the sweet spot that indigenous farmers discovered centuries ago and that colonial farmers adopted. In each mound, you'll see 4 or 5 corn plants growing together. Why multiple plants? Insurance against failure. One seed might not germinate. A bird might eat one sprout. An insect might destroy another. Plant 5, expect 3 to survive. Those 3 plants will shade the ground around them, suppressing weeds, and their roots will share the mound's nutrients. But notice what else is growing in these corn mounds. Climbing up the corn stalks, you see bean plants. And spreading along the ground between the mounds, squash vines with their broad leaves. This is the Three Sisters system, and it's one of the most elegant pieces of agricultural engineering you'll ever encounter. The corn grows tall and provides a structure for the beans to climb. The beans, like all legumes, have nodules on their roots containing bacteria that fix nitrogen from the air and convert it into a form plants can use. This nitrogen fertilizes the corn. The squash spreads along the ground, its large leaves shading the soil, retaining moisture and preventing weed growth. 3 plants, 3 different root depths, 3 different nutrient requirements, all supporting each other. Together, they produce more food from the same land than any one crop could produce alone. And the colonists didn't invent this system. They learned it from the Native Americans, who had been perfecting it for thousands of years. Understanding this system requires understanding soil chemistry in practical empirical terms. The colonists didn't know the word nitrogen, but they knew that planting beans made the soil better for other crops. They didn't know about photosynthesis, but they knew that squash leaves shading the ground kept moisture in the soil during dry spells. This kind of knowledge, practical, observational, passed down through demonstration rather than written instruction, is what kept colonial agriculture productive. Academic knowledge would come later. For now, what mattered was what worked. The work of maintaining these fields is relentless. Right now in early summer, weeding is the primary task. See that man walking down the corn rows with a hoe? That hoe is a simple tool, a wooden handle with a metal blade attached at an angle. But using it effectively requires skill and endurance. He's working in a rhythm. Chop, step, chop, step. The blade cuts into the soil just deep enough to sever weed roots without disturbing the crop plants. Too shallow, and the weeds survive. Too deep, and you damage the corn roots. The right depth, the right angle, the right force. These are things he learned by doing, not by reading. His hands are calloused from years of gripping that wooden handle. His back aches from bending over row after row. His shirt is soaked with sweat, even though it's only mid-morning. This is what farming actually looks like. Not pastoral scenes of people wandering through fields, but hard physical labor performed day after day, week after week, month after month. How much land can one person weed in a day? About half an acre if the soil is good and the weeds aren't too thick. A family farm might have 5 or 6 acres under cultivation. That means weeding is a full-time job for multiple people for weeks during the growing season. Miss a week and the weeds can get ahead of you. Miss 2 weeks and you might lose the crop entirely. But the weeding is just one task in the agricultural calendar. Look over at that other field where wheat is growing. Wheat requires different timing, different techniques, different tools than corn. The wheat was planted last fall, spent the winter as small shoots under the snow, and is now growing toward harvest in late summer. Harvesting wheat means using a scythe, a long curved blade attached to a wooden handle. Using a scythe properly is an art form that takes years to master. You stand with your legs apart, swing the blade in a smooth arc parallel to the ground, cutting through the wheat stalks about 6 inches above the soil. The motion uses your whole body, legs, hips, back, arms working together in a coordinated movement. A skilled man with a scythe can harvest about an acre of wheat per day, but he can't work continuously. The physical exertion is too intense. He works for an hour, rests for 15 minutes, works another hour all day long, and even with this pace, his muscles will be screaming by evening. The cut wheat falls in neat rows called swaths. Behind the man with the scythe come others who gather the cut stalks into bundles called sheave, tie them with twisted straw, and stack them into shocks, teepee-shaped arrangements that let air circulate while keeping rain off the grain heads. The sheave will sit in the field for a week or two, drying thoroughly. Then they'll be loaded onto carts and taken to the barn for threshing. The process of separating the grain from the straw. Threshing happens on the barn floor. Sheaves are spread out and beaten with wooden tools called flails, 2 sticks connected by a leather thong. You swing the flail so the free stick strikes the grain heads, knocking the kernels loose. Swing, hit, swing, hit, swing, hit, all day long. The rhythm is hypnotic, but the work is exhausting. After threshing comes winnowing. The grain and chaff are mixed together on the barn floor. On a windy day, you take a wooden shovel and toss the mixture into the air. The wind blows away the lightweight chaff while the heavier grain falls back to the floor. Toss, let the wind sort it. Gather the grain, repeat. Hours and hours of repetitive work. At the end of this entire process, planting, growing, harvesting, threshing, winnowing, you have grain. Clean grain that can be stored in barrels or sacks, ground into flour as needed, and baked into bread. From 1 acre of wheat, a good harvest might yield 20 bushels. A bushel of wheat weighs about 60 pounds and produces about 42 pounds of flour. That acre then produces about 840 pounds of flour. An adult doing physical labor needs about 2 pounds of bread per day to maintain body weight and energy. Call it 1.5 pounds of flour to make that bread. That means your acre of wheat produces enough flour for 1 person for about 560 days, a year and a half. These calculations mattered. Colonial families had to know with reasonable accuracy how much land they needed to plant to feed themselves through the year. Too little, and they starve. Too much, and they've wasted labor they could have spent on other tasks. The math was life and death, performed without calculators or spreadsheets, based on experience and passed down knowledge. Now look over at the vegetable garden near the house. This is primarily the woman's domain, though children help here too. The garden is smaller than the grain fields, maybe a 1/4 acre, but teas intensively managed. Here grow the foods that add variety and nutrition to the basic diet of grain and meat. Cabbages, which can be harvested in fall and stored in the root cellar through winter. Onions, which add flavor to soups and stews. Turnips and carrots, which store well and provide food when fresh vegetables are gone. Peas and beans, which can be dried and stored indefinitely. Herbs grow here too, not just for cooking, but for medicine. Sage for sore throats, chamomile for upset stomachs, feverfew for headaches, lavender for calming nerves. Each plant serves multiple purposes, and the knowledge of which plant helps which ailment is passed from mother to daughter, accumulated over generations of observation and experience. The garden requires different work than the fields. Here you're bending, constantly working on your knees, using hand tools to work soil around individual plants. You're thinning seedlings, pulling out the weaker plants so the stronger ones have room to grow. You're pinching off side shoots from tomato plants to direct energy to fruit production. You're checking for caterpillars that can strip a cabbage plant overnight. This is detail work that can't be shed, rush, and you damage plants, miss problems that will compound later. The garden produces less total food than the grain fields, but it produces variety and nutrients that grain alone can't provide. Without the vitamins from fresh vegetables, people develop deficiency diseases, scurvy, pellagra, rickets. Near the garden, you'll find the chickens, a dozen or so hens and a rooster scratching in the dirt, pecking at insects and scattered grain. These birds are smaller than modern chickens, maybe 5 pounds for a hen, 7 for a rooster. They're scrawnier, more active, more like wild birds than modern domestic fowl. But they're valuable beyond their size. Each hen produces perhaps 150 eggs per year. Not the 300 eggs a modern laying hen produces, but enough to make a real contribution to the family's protein intake. The eggs are smaller than modern eggs, but they're rich and flavorful because the chickens eat a varied diet of insects, plants, and kitchen scraps. Gathering eggs is a daily task, usually given to children old enough to be responsible, but young enough that their labor isn't critical for heavy farm work. The chicken coop is a small wooden structure, simple but predator-prone, with nesting boxes where the hens prefer to lay. But here's something you notice quickly. Gathering eggs isn't a simple matter of reaching into nesting boxes. These hens are protective. They'll peck at your hand if you reach under them. You learn to distract them with one hand while grabbing eggs with the other. You learn which hens are more aggressive and which are docile. You develop a relationship with these birds based on daily interaction and practical necessity. The rooster serves a crucial purpose beyond fertilizing eggs. He's a guard animal. At the first sign of a hawk overhead or a fox approaching, he sounds an alarm that sends the hens running for cover. A good rooster can be the difference between keeping your flock and losing it to predators. Over near the barn, you see the cow. Just one cow for most families. Keeping multiple cattle requires more pasture and more labor than most can manage. This cow is a dual-purpose animal, providing both milk and eventually, after her productive years are over, meat. She's being milked now. The woman sits on a low wooden stool, a wooden bucket between her knees, her hands working in the rhythmic squeeze and pull motion that draws ilk from the udder. This is skilled work. Pull too hard and you hurt the cow. Too gentle and you don't get much milk. The right pressure, the right rhythm, and the milk comes in steady streams, making a distinctive sound as it hits the bottom of the wooden bucket. A good milk cow in colonial times might produce 3 gallons of milk per day during peak production in spring and summer. That's impressive until you realize that a modern dairy cow produces about 8 gallons per day. Colonial cows were smaller, fed on pasture rather than grain-rich feed and bred for multiple purposes rather than specialized milk production. But 3 gallons a day is still substantial. Fresh milk doesn't keep long without refrigeration, perhaps a day in cool weather, less in summer heat. So that milk has to be processed quickly into forms that store better. Some of it gets drunk fresh, of course. Children especially benefit from the protein and calcium, but the majority gets transformed. Cream rises to the top of fresh milk if you let it sit. Skim that cream off and you can churn it into butter. The butter churn is a wooden barrel with a wooden plunger that fits through a hole in the lid. Pour cream into the churn. Work to. He plunger up and down for what feels like forever. Usually 30 to 40 minutes until the fat globules in the cream start to clump together. Suddenly, the texture changes. What was liquid cream becomes solid butter and liquid buttermilk. Pour off the buttermilk, which is actually nutritious and useful for baking. Gather the butter. Rinse it in cold water to remove buttermilk. Work it with wooden paddles to press out excess moisture. Add salt for preservation and flavor. What you end up with is butter that will keep for weeks in a cool cellar. A gallon of cream produces about 2 pounds of butter. At peak production, the cow is producing enough cream for a pound of butter every other day. That butter is valuable. It can be sold or traded for goods the family can't produce themselves, or it can be carefully hoarded in crocks, packed in salt, stored in the coolest part of the cellar for use through winter when the cow's milk production drops. The remaining milk gets made into cheese, and simple cheese production involves heating milk to a specific temperature around 90 degrees Fahrenheit, adding something acidic like vinegar or rennet from a calf's stomach and waiting for the milk to curdle. The SEO lid curds are separated from the liquid whey, pressed together to remove more moisture, salted, and aged. Fresh cheese can be eaten immediately. Aged cheese, stored in a cool place for weeks or months, develops more complex flavors and keeps longer. A skilled cheesemaker learns to judge the exact temperature, the exact amount of acid, the exact pressing pressure that produces the best cheese. This knowledge comes from experience. Hundreds of batches, each one slightly different, each one teaching something. The whey left over from cheese isn't wasted. It goes to the pig. But every family that can afford it keeps a pig or two because pigs are remarkably efficient at converting waste into meat. Kitchen scraps away from cheese-making grain that's gone moldy. Vegetables past their prime. All of it goes to the pig. A pig, raised from spring to fall, can reach 200 pounds by November. When the weather turns cold enough for safe butchering, that pig represents perhaps 150 pounds of meat after butchering. Hams, bacon, chops, organ meat, fat for rendering into lard. For a family of 6 or 8 people, that's a substantial portion of their annual protein requirement. Butchering day is a community event. Tea requires multiple people, specific knowledge, and quick work. The pig must be killed humanely and quickly. The blood must be caught for making blood sausage. The body must be scalded in boiling water to loosen the hair, then scraped clean. The carcass must be opened carefully to avoid puncturing intestines. Organs must be removed and processed immediately. Every part of the pig gets used. The meat is sorted by type: ham, shoulder, bacon, chops. The organs become head cheese, liver pudding, sausage casings. The fat is rendered into lard for cooking and soap making. The bones are saved for soup stock. Even the bristles are kept for making brushes. Most of the meat gets preserved immediately. Some pieces are packed in salt, layers of meat, layers of salt in wooden barrels. The salt draws out moisture and creates an environment where bacteria can't survive. Salt pork and salt ham will keep for months, even through summer heat, though they become harder and saltier the longer they're stored. Other pieces get smoked. The smokehouse is a small outbuilding where meat hangs from rafters, while a low fire of hardwood, hickory, oak, or maple smolders below. The smoke does several things. 1. Tea dries the meat. It deposits chemicals that inhibit bacterial growth, and it adds flavor. A properly smoked ham can hang in a cool, dry place for a year without spoiling. The lard rendered from pig fat is almost as valuable as the meat. Lard stores well in crocks, provides concentrated calories for cooking, and serves as the fat component in soap making. A 200-pound pig might yield 30 pounds of rendered lard, enough for a year of cooking and soap production. Making soap combines lard with lye in a chemical reaction called saponification. The lye comes from wood ashes. When you pour water through wood ashes, it dissolves potassium compounds, creating a caustic solution. This lye water is dangerous. It can burn skin-blind eyes if splashed. But mix it carefully with melted lard at the right temperature and a chemical reaction occurs. The result is soap. Colonial soap is harsh by modern standards. It's made for washing clothes and dishes, not bodies. Using it on your skin would leave you red and irritated. But for cleaning pots caked with food residue or clothes stained with dirt and sweat, it works remarkably well. The process of making soap happens once or twice a year, producing enough to last until the next batch. The woman doing this work wears old clothes and works carefully, knowing that a splash of lye can cause serious burns. She stirs the lard and lye mixture in an iron pot over an outdoor fire, watching for the moment when the consistency changes from liquid to something thicker, more custard-like. That's when soaponification is complete. She pours the soap into wooden molds, lets it harden, then cuts it into bars. These bars won't win any beauty contests. They're brown or grey, rough-surfaced with an earthy smell, but they represent chemistry understood through practice, a useful product made from materials that might otherwise be wasted. All of this, the grain growing, the garden tending, the livestock management, the food preservation, the soap making happen simultaneously, overlapping, demanding attention according to seasonal schedules that can't be delayed. Miss the right week for planting and your yield suffers. Wait too long to harvest and rain ruins your grain. Delay butchering until weather warms and the meat spoils before you can preserve it. The colonial family operates on multiple timelines at once. Daily tasks like milking, feeding animals, cooking, ng meals. Weekly tasks like baking bread, doing laundry, going to market. Monthly tasks like churning butter in quantity, smoking meat, making cheese. Seasonal tasks like planting, harvesting, butchering, preserving. Coordinating all of this requires intelligence and planning that we rarely acknowledge. These aren't simple people doing simple work. They're managing complex systems with multiple variables, making decisions that cascade through weeks or months, allocating limited resources, time, energy, money, materials, to maximize survival chances. And they're doing it without written schedules, without alarm clocks, without the planning tools we take for granted. They're doing it through experience, observation, and knowledge, passed down through demonstration and practice. The sun is high now, midday. Time for the main meal of the day. The family gathers around the table we saw this morning. The food is simple but substantial. Bread, cheese, maybe some preserved meat, water from the well or cider from last fall's apple harvest. Everyone eats with their hands or uses spoons carved from wood. Conversation is practical, discussing afternoon tasks, planning tomorrow's work, solving problems that have arisen. After the meal, there's no rest. The afternoon brings more work, always more work. Because in colonial America, survival isn't something you achieve once and then maintain. It's something you earn again every single day through competent execution of necessary tasks. Now, let's talk about commerce and trade and businesses. Not every colonial family lives the same life we've been observing. Walk into town, if there is a town within a day's travel, and you'll see a different world operating on different rules with different challenges and different rewards. The town might be small, perhaps 30 buildings clustered around a central common where militia drills happen and cattle graze. Perhaps a church with its distinctive steeple marking the settlement from miles away. Perhaps a tavern, a general store, a blacksmith shop, and houses ranging from small to substantial depending on their owner's wealth. This is where the classes separate visibly. In the countryside, everyone works with their hands, and everyone looks roughly similar. Worn clothes, calloused hands, weathered faces. But in town, you can identify a person's social position at a glance. See that man wow! King down the street. His coat is made of wool so fine it almost shimmers. The buttons are brass, polished to a shine. His breeches fit properly. They're tailored, not just cut from a pattern and sewn loose. His stockings are white silk. His shoes have silver buckles. His wig is powdered white and styled in the latest fashion from London. This is a wealthy merchant, or perhaps a large landowner. His wealth doesn't come from working with his hands, it comes from owning things: land, ships, trading partnerships, credit relationships that span the Atlantic. He might own the general store where ordinary families buy the few goods they can't produce themselves. He might own shares in ships that carry tobacco from Virginia to England and manufactured goods from England back to the colonies. His house reflects his status. It's 2 stories tall, made of brick rather than wood. Brick requires brickmakers, kilns, specialized knowledge, and significant capital investment. Each brick was formed in a mold, dried, fired at high temperature, transported to the building site, and laid by skilled masons using mortar mixed to exact specifications. A brick house might cost 10 times what a wooden house costs. Inside, the rooms have specialized purposes. A parlor for receiving guests, furnished with chairs upholstered in imported fabric. A dining room with a table large enough for formal dinners set with or even silver serving pieces. A library with actual books, leather-bound volumes shipped from London at enormous expense. His wife wears a dress made of silk or fine cotton imported from India. The fabric alone might cost more than a farm family makes in a year. The dress is constructed with dozens of tiny stitches fitted precisely to her body by a professional seamstress. She wears a corset underneath, stays made with whale bone strips that shape her torso into the fashionable silhouette. Her day looks nothing like the farm wife's day we observed earlier. She doesn't milk cows or churn butter or tend fires. She has servants for that, possibly indentured servants who've sold years of their labor to pay for passage to America, possibly enslaved people if she lives in the southern colonies where slavery has become the foundation of the economy. Instead, she manages the household. She directs the servants, plans menus, orders supplies from the store, maintains social relationships with other wealthy families through formal visiting and dinner parties. Her work is administrative, social, and symbolic rather than physical. But here's what's crucial to understand. Even this wealthy family lives without electricity, without indoor plumbing, without central heating, without any of the technologies that make modern life comfortable. They have more candles than poor families, but candles are still their only source of light after dark. They have servants to carry water, but water still has to be carried bucket by bucket. They have larger fireplaces and more firewood, but they're still dependent on fire for heat and cooking. Wealth in colonial America buys you nicer versions of the same basic technologies everyone else uses. It doesn't buy you fundamentally different technologies. The gap between rich and poor is real and significant. But it's not the chasm that exists in modern societies. Now look at that man working in the blacksmith shop. He's middle class, not wealthy, not poor, but somewhere in between. He owns his shop and his tools, which represent significant capital. A proper blacksmith's anvil might weigh 200 pounds and cost a year's wages. The tools hanging on, his wools, hammers, tongs, chisels, punches, each one represents an investment. His forge is the heart of his business. It's a specially designed fireplace that burns charcoal rather than wood, because charcoal produces higher temperatures with less smoke. A bellows, a large leather bag with wooden handles, forces air into the fire, raising the temperature high enough to make iron glow white hot. Watch him work. He pulls a piece of iron from the forge using long-handled tongs. The iron is glowing orange-red, radiating heat you can feel from several feet away. He places it on the anvil, and strikes it with a hammer. The hammer weighs perhaps 3 pounds, and he swings it with controlled force, hard enough to shape the metal, not so hard that he loses control. The sound is distinctive, a clear ringing tone as hammer meets hot iron. Strike, reposition, strike, reposition. Each blow moves the metal slightly, gradually shaping it into whatever form is needed. A horseshoe curves under repeated strikes. A nail emerges from a rod of iron worked with practiced precision. A hinge takes shape through a series of bends and holes punched through glowing metal. The skill required is enormous. Iron has a narrow temperature range where it's soft enough to shape, but not so hot that it burns and crumbles. The blacksmith judges this temperature by color. Yellow-white is welding heat. Orange-red is forging heat. Cherry red is too cool for heavy work. These distinctions were learned through years of apprenticeship, watching a master ruining pieces through mistakes, gradually developing the eye and the judgment that separates skilled work from amateur attempts. And the blacksmith's product is essential to the entire community. Farmers need plowshares, hoes, axes, and scythes. Carpenters need saws, chisels, and planes. Housewives need pots, kettles, and cooking implements. Everyone needs nails, hinges, and latches. Without the blacksmith, the colonial economy grinds to a halt. His prices reflect his skill and the value of his work. A horseshoe might cost a day's wages for a laborer. A set of hinges for a door might cost 3 days' wages. An axe, a tool that a farmer will use almost daily for years, might cost a week's wages. Now, these aren't arbitrary prices. They reflect the time and skill required to produce the item, the cost of materials, and the value the item provides. The blacksmith, his income places him solidly in the middle class. He can afford a wooden house with glass windows, real glass, not oiled paper. He can afford to send his children to a dame school to learn reading and arithmetic. He can afford meat several times a week instead of just on special occasions. But he still works with his hands. He still sweats over his forge. He still goes to bed exhausted from physical labor. His position in society comes from his skill and his ownership of capital. The shop, the tools, the forge, the knowledge in his head. This is the colonial middle class. People who work, but who have skills that command premium prices and who own the tools of their trade. Walk further into town, and you'll find the general store. This is where the commercial economy becomes visible in concentrated form. The store carries goods that local families can't produce themselves. Sugar and molasses shipped from the Caribbean. Tea from China transported halfway around the world. Coffee beans from South America. Salt from coastal salt works. Iron pots and tools from England. Fabric, linen, wool, sometimes silk, imported because local production can't meet demand. The prices are shocking by the standards of what local labor earns. A pound of sugar might cost half a day's wages. A pound of tea might cost 3 days' wages. A new iron pot might cost a week's wages. These aren't everyday purchases for ordinary families. They're investments carefully considered, often saved for over months. The store operates on credit as much as cash. The storekeeper keeps a ledger book where he records who owes what. A farmer might bring in eggs, butter, or grain and trade them for credit in the store's account. Later, he'll use that credit to buy sugar or tea or fabric his wife needs. The storekeeper profits from the markup between what he pays for goods wholesale and what he charges retail, and from the interest he charges on credit extended. This credit system is crucial because actual money, coins made of silver or gold, is scarce in the colonies. Most transactions happen through barter or credit. You trade your labor or your products for goods or services you need. The storekeeper acts as a kind of banker, extending credit, keeping accounts, facilitating exchange in an economy that runs on trust and relationship, as much as on currency. The tavern serves a similar function, but for different, NT kinds of exchange. It's a place to sleep if you're traveling, a place to eat if you don't want to cook, but most importantly, a place where information flows and deals get made. Inside the tavern, you'll find farmers discussing crop prices, merchants negotiating deals, travelers sharing news from other colonies or from England. There's no newspaper in most small towns, news travels by word of mouth, and the tavern is where that exchange happens. The tavern keeper serves beer, ale, cider, and stronger spirits like rum and whiskey. Colonial Americans drink alcohol with every meal, including breakfast, partly because it's safer than water in towns where wells might be contaminated. A typical adult might consume a quart of beer or cider per day, plus occasional stronger drinks. The prices are regulated by law in many colonies. A pint of beer might cost the equivalent of an hour's wages for a laborer. Room and board for a night might cost a day's wages. These prices are set to be affordable for travelers while providing the tavern keeper with a living. But the tavern is also a business in ways that aren't immediately obvious. The tavern keeper needs to manage inventory, barrels of beer and cider, stores of food, bedding for rooms upstairs. He needs to extend credit carefully, knowing which customers will pay and which won't. He needs to maintain relationships with suppliers who provide the alcohol and food he serves. And he needs to manage the social dynamics of a space where people drink, argue, gamble, and occasionally fight. The economic life of the town is fundamentally different from the economic life of the farm, but they're interdependent. Farmers need the goods that merchants import and storekeepers sell. They need the blacksmith's tools and the miller's services and the tavern's lodging. In return, farmers provide the food that feeds everyone who doesn't. Tea farm, the merchants, the craftsmen, the storekeepers, the tavern keepers. This interdependence creates a web of relationships and obligations that hold colonial society together. The farmer who can't pay the blacksmith in cash might offer to help build the blacksmith's new barn. The merchant who needs grain to export might extend credit to the farmer to buy tools, expecting to be paid back after harvest. The storekeeper, who knows his customers personally, understands who can be trusted with credit and who can't. But this system has deep inequalities built into it. The wealthy merchant or landowner has access to credit from England. He can buy goods wholesale and sell retail. He can extend credit to others and charge interest. His capital generates more capital through lending, trading, and investing. The middle-class craftsman has his skill and his tools. He can command good prices for his work, but his income is limited by how much he can personally produce. He can't scale his business much beyond his own labor, and perhaps an apprentice or two. The poor farmer or laborer has only his labor to sell. He's always one bad harvest, one accident, one illness away from disaster. He is dependent on credit from those above him. And that dependency creates power relationships that shape his options and his freedom. And below all of them, in the southern colonies especially, are the enslaved people. They own nothing. They earn nothing. They have no legal rights. Their labor is extracted by force. And the wealth they create flows entirely to those who claim to own them. This is the brutal reality underlying the colonial economy. The prosperity of wealthy planters in Virginia and South Carolina is built directly on enslaved labor. The rice and tobacco that make them rich are planted, tended, and harvested by people who will never benefit from their own work. The fine houses and imported luxuries are purchased with wealth extracted from people who sleep in rough quarters and eat minimal rations. The northern colonies have slavery too, though on a smaller scale. Even in New England, some wealthy families own enslaved people to work as domestic servants or skilled laborers. The moral horror of this system exists alongside the everyday economic calculations that make it persist. Understanding colonial commerce means understanding these different levels operating simultaneously. Twice. The subsistence farmer producing primarily for his own family's consumption. The craftsman producing goods for sale to the local community. The merchant trading goods across long distances. The wealthy landowner extracting profit from land and labor. And underlying everything in the southern colonies, the enslaved people whose forced labor creates wealth they'll never share in. The sun is getting lower now. In town, people are finishing their daily business. The blacksmith banks his forge, knowing he'll need to revive it tomorrow. The storekeeper tallies his accounts, marking who bought what on credit. The tavern begins to fill with locals stopping for a drink before heading home. This is colonial commerce, not a simple or a pure system, but a complex web of production, exchange, credit, and power relationships. It works efficiently enough to support a growing population and increasing prosperity for some, but it works through exploitation and inequality that benefits some at the expense of others. The genius of the system is in its networks. How goods flow from Europe to the colonies and back. How credit relationships allow exchange in a cash-poor economy. How specialized craftsmen serve broader communities. The injustice of the system is in its distributions. Who owns what? Who benefits from whose labor? Who has power and who doesn't? As evening approaches, it's time to return to the countryside to see how colonial families face the season that tests everything they've built. Winter is coming, and winter, more than any other season, will reveal whether the systems we've observed are sufficient for survival. The first frost comes in October, sometimes late September, if you're unlucky. You wake up one morning and see it. A thin white coating on everything outside, glittering in the early light. The garden plants that were green yesterday are black and wilted today. The growing season is over. What you've grown, preserved, and stored is what you have. There will be no more until spring. This is when the calculations matter. Every colonial family has been doing math in their heads all summer and fall. Serum rough calculations that determine whether they live or die. How many bushels of wheat did we harvest? How many barrels of salted pork? How many crocks of butter? How much firewood have we cut and stacked? The firewood calculation is especially critical. ICAL. A colonial house in New England might burn through 30 cords of wood in a winter. A cord is a stack 4 feet high, 4 tons wide, and 8 feet long, 128 cubic feet of wood. 30 cords means 3,840 cubic feet of wood. All of it cut, split, and stacked before the snow gets too deep to work. Cutting that much wood is a full-time job for one man for about 3 months. The process starts in late spring or early summer when the sap is down and the wood will dry properly. You select trees. Dead ones are ideal because they're already dry, but live trees work too if you give them time to season. Felling a tree with a handsaw and an axe is brutal work. A tree 2 feet in diameter might take an hour to bring down. Then it has to be limbumed, all the branches cut off and stacked separately for kindling. Then the trunk has to be cut into sections short enough to fit in your fireplace. 16 inches is standard. Each cut through a 2-foot diameter trunk takes 10 minutes of steady sawing. Then comes splitting. You stand each round on end and drive a wedge into it with a sledgehammer. The wood splits along the grain. Hardwood, like oak, splits cleanly if you hit it right. Naughty wood or wood with twisted grain can resist splitting, requiring multiple wedges, more hammering, more time. The split wood has to be stacked properly. Stack it too tight and air can't circulate, meaning it won't dry properly and will smoke instead of burning clean. Stack it too loose and you're wasting space. The proper technique creates a stable stack with air gaps that let moisture escape over the summer months. By fall, that wood needs to be moved closer to the house. You can't be trudging through snow to a woodpile 50 yards away every time you need to feed the fire. So, you stack several cords right next to the house under a roof, if possible to keep snow off, where you can grab wood quickly when needed. The math is simple, but unforgiving. If you've cut 25 cords and you need 30, you'll run out of firewood sometime in late February. When that happens, you'll be burning furniture, fence posts, anything that will burn. You'll be cold, desperately cold. And if the cold doesn't kill you directly, it will weaken you enough that disease might finish the job. So, colonial families cut extra. They aim for 35 cords if they think they need 30. The margin for error is their insurance policy against a winter that's harder than expected or that's not as dry as it should be. Food calculations follow similar logic. An adult doing physical labor needs about 3,000 calories per day to maintain body weight. Through a 6-month winter, that's about 540,000 calories per person. For a family of 6, you're looking at 3.2 million calories that need to be stored in the cellar, the smokehouse, and the barrels in the barn. What does 3.2 million calories look like? About 400 pounds of wheat flour provides roughly 1 million calories. So, you need 1,200 pounds of flour just for bread, adding cornmeal, dried beans, salted pork, smoked ham or butter, cheese, dried apples, turnips, carrots stored in the root cellar. The total amount of food required to keep a family alive through winter is staggering. And every bit of it had to be produced by that family's own labor or traded for with surplus they produced. There's no grocery store to fall back on. There's no emergency food distribution. If you run out in March, you starve. It's that simple. The root cellar is where much of this food lives. If you haven't seen a proper root cellar, it's easy to underestimate the engineering involved. The cellar is dug into a hillside or beneath the house, deep, enough that the surrounding earth provides insulation. 6 feet deep, minimum, 8 feet is better. The walls might be lined with stone to prevent collapse and to provide thermal mass that moderates temperature swings. The ceiling is heavy timber covered with earth, more thermal mass, more insulation. The entrance is small and fitted with a heavy door to minimize heat transfer with the outside air. Inside, the temperature stays remarkably stable. In winter, even when it's below freezing outside, the root cellar might maintain a temperature of 35 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. That's cold enough to slow decay and prevent sprouting, but warm enough that stored vegetables don't freeze. Root vegetables are stored in specific ways. Carrots and turnips are layered in boxes filled with damp sand. The sand keeps them from drying out while the cool temperature prevents rotting. Potatoes are stored in barrels or bins, checked regularly for any that are starting to rot. One bad potato can infect others nearby. Cabbages might be hung from the ceiling by their roots or buried in straw. Apples are wrapped individually in paper if the family can afford paper, or in cloth if they can't, and stored in barrels. The wrapping prevents one rotting apple from touching others. Even so, the family will check the apple barrels weekly, removing any fruit that's starting to go bad. The knowledge required to run a successful root cellar is substantial. You need to understand humidity. Too dry and vegetables desiccate. Too wet and they rot. You need to understand air circulation. Stagnant air promotes mold growth. You need to understand temperature. Different vegetables have different optimal storage temperatures, and you need to monitor constantly. A root cellar isn't something you fill in October and forget about until March. It's a living system that requires regular attention. Someone goes down there every few days to check on things, to remove anything that's starting to fail, to adjust humidity by adding or removing damp cloths, to ensure that the food you're counting on to keep your family alive is actually staying good. But even with careful storage, food runs low by late winter. The bread is made from flour that's starting to taste stale. The preserved meat is harder and saltier than it was in November. The last apples are wrinkled and mealy. The butter is running out. The cheese is nearly gone. This is where, in you understand the phrase, spring tonic. After months of preserved food with declining nutritional value, people develop deficiency symptoms. Their gums might bleed. Early scurvy from lack of vitamin C, their joints ache. They feel weak and tired beyond what winter cold alone would explain. The first wild greens of spring, dandelion leaves, watercress, anything green and fresh are consumed eagerly, not because they taste good, but because the body is desperate for nutrients it hasn't had in months. These plants literally save lives by providing vitamins that stored food has lost. But winter's dangers go far beyond food and fuel shortages. Disease spreads rapidly when families are crowded together in small, poorly ventilated houses. The same fire that keeps you warm also keeps you breathing smoke all day, every day. The lack of bathing, even more pronounced in winter when heating water is expensive, creates ideal conditions for body lice, which spread typhus. Respiratory infections are constant. Someone is always coughing. Colds spread from person to person through the household. What starts as a simple cold can turn into pneumonia, especially in the very young or the very old. Without antibiotics, pneumonia is often fatal. The treatment options are limited and often ineffective. The sick person is kept warm, given broth to maintain hydration, and perhaps dosed with herbal remedies that might or might not help. Elderberry tea for fevers, wound for coughs, garlic for infections. Some of these have actual medicinal properties. Others are pure placebo. None of them can cure bacterial pneumonia or influenza. When someone dies, and people do die regularly, especially children and the elderly, the winter complicates everything. The ground is frozen too hard to dig a grave. Bodies might be stored in unheated outbuildings until spring allows burial. The grief of loss is compounded by the practical impossibility of proper burial. But colonial families develop coping mechanisms that go beyond individual preparation. The community becomes essential in winter in ways that summer agriculture doesn't require. When one family runs short of firewood, neighbors share, not out of pure altruism, though that's part of it, but out of mutual self-interest. You help your neighbor now because you might need their help later. This is insurance in human form. When someone gets sick, neighboring women come to help with nursing, with cooking, with managing the household, while the regular caregivers are overwhelmed. This isn't optional charity. It's a social obligation that everyone understands and participates in, because everyone knows they might need it someday. When a barn roof collapses under snow, and they do collapse regularly, men from surrounding farms gather to repair it before the livestock freeze. They do this knowing that their barn might be next, knowing that they're creating obligation networks that will protect them when they need help. These mutual aid systems are formalized in various ways. Some communities have written agreements about sharing resources during emergencies. Some churches maintain food stores specifically for distribution to families in crisis. Some towns have appointed officials responsible for identifying families in need and coordinating assistance. The social pressure to contribute to these systems is intense. A family that refuses to help neighbors in need will find themselves isolated when they need help. Reputation matters enormously in small communities where everyone knows everyone else and where your survival might depend. Ninth, on others' willingness to assist you. Winter evenings provide rare opportunities for leisure, though leisure in colonial terms looks different than modern recreation. With darkness falling at 4 or 5 in the afternoon and no electric lights to extend the day, families gather around the fire for what might be the only unstructured time of their week. This is when storytelling happens. Oral tradition is how culture, history, and values get transmitted in a society where many people can't read. The stories might be Bible stories, everyone knowing them already but enjoying the retelling. They might be folk tales brought from Europe, tales of clever peasants, outwitting nobles, of supernatural creatures, of moral lessons delivered through allegory. The stories might be family history, grandfather talking about the old country, about the voyage across the Atlantic, about the early days of settlement when life was even harder than it is now. These stories serve multiple purposes: entertainment, yes, but also education, cultural continuity, moral instruction. Music happens too. Someone might have a fiddle, homemade, but functional, capable of playing dance tunes and ballads. The fiddle is small, portable, relatively easy to make, and doesn't require the musical literacy that written sheet music would demand. The tunes are passed down by ear, learned through imitation and practice. Singing is even more universal. Work songs that coordinate group labor during the day become evening entertainment. Hymns learned at church, ballads that tell stories in verse, singing together creates social bonding, marks cultural identity, and provides entertainment that costs nothing. Children play games by firelight, simple games with simple rules. They might play Jack Straws, a game where you pile up sticks and try to remove them one at a time without disturbing the others. They might play blind man's bluff or hide the thimble. They might make shadow puppets on the wall using their hands and the flickering firelight. These games aren't just entertainment. They're training in hand-eye coordination, in following rules, in social interaction. They're how children learn to function in their society. Women use evening time for handwork that doesn't require good light. Knitting is ideal. You can knit by touch once you've learned the basic stitches. A woman might knit stockings for her family, wily, while sitting by the fire, her hands working automatically while she talks or listens to stories. Mending happens too. Clothes are too valuable to discard when they tear or wear thin. They're patched, darned, and repaired until they literally fall apart. This work can be done by firelight, and it's necessary work, not optional. Men might work on tools, carving a new handle for an axe, or repairing a broken harness. This work continues even in the evening because tool maintenance is essential, and there's never enough time during daylight hours to do everything that needs doing. But there are limits to what you can do by firelight and candlelight. Candles are expensive. A pound of tallow, animal fat rendered down, produces about 10 candles. Those 10 candles might provide 30 hours of light total. For a family trying to extend their productive hours through winter darkness, that's not much. So most families use candles sparingly. Maybe one candle for the evening placed centrally, where its light serves multiple people. The rest of the room is in shadow. You work close to the fire, close to the candle, in a small circle of light surrounded by darkness. This is another way winter is. Testing the systems. Not just testing whether you have enough food and fuel, but testing whether the social bonds hold, whether the community support networks function, whether the cultural practices that give meaning to suffering are strong enough to sustain people through months of cold, darkness, and deprivation. And most years, the systems work. Most families make it through. They emerge in spring, thinner, weaker, eager for fresh food and warm weather, but alive. The systems, food preservation, fuel preparation, community mutual aid, cultural practices that maintain morale, prove adequate, but not every year. Bad winters kill people. Harsh springs, where the cold persists too long and food runs out before anything new can be harvested. Disease outbreaks that overwhelm communities already weakened by winter deprivation. These things happen, and when they do, families fail. Farms are abandoned. Communities shrink. The colonial period is often romanticized, But the reality is stark. Survival is never guaranteed. It's earned through competent execution of complex systems, through community cooperation, through endurance and determination, and sometimes just luck. As February turns to March, and the days slowly lengthen, as the sun climbs a bit higher each day, and the ice begins to loosen its grip, people start watching for signs of spring. The first robin, the first green shoots in the garden, the first day warm enough to open the windows and air out the house. These signs bring hope. Hope that they've made it through another winter. Hope that the cycle is continuing, that life will return, that the hard times are ending and productive times are beginning again. But spring brings its own challenges and its own work. Fields to prepare, crops to plant, animals to tend. The cycle never stops. Survival is a continuous process, not a destination you reach and then rest. This is what colonial Americans understood in their bones. Life is work, work is survival, and survival requires systems that function reliably under stress. The systems they built, agricultural, commercial, social, cultural, were tested every winter and refined through generations of experience. Understanding these systems helps us understand what's coming next. Because these same people shaped by these experiences, tested by these winters, bound together by these networks of mutual dependence, regarding to face a different kind of test, a political test, a test that will require them to decide whether the larger system they're part of, the colonial relationship with Great Britain, is worth maintaining or worth breaking. By the 1760s, the colonial systems we've been observing have been operating successfully for more than a century. Families know how to survive winters. Communities know how to support each other. The economy functions through networks of trade, credit, and mutual obligation. The colonies are prosperous, not wealthy by European standards, but productive, growing, and increasingly confident in their own capabilities. And then gradually, the relationship with Great Britain begins to break down, not suddenly, not over one dramatic event, but through a series of policy changes that make colonial families start questioning whether the arrangement they've accepted for generations actually serves their interests. The 7 Years' War, called the French and Indian War in the colonies, ends in 1763, with Britain victorious, but deeply in debt. The war was fought partly to protect British colonial interests in North America. Now, Britain looks at the colonies and sees poor potential revenue to help pay down that debt. The Sugar Act of 1764 places new taxes on molasses imported from the Caribbean. This might seem like a minor thing. Who cares about molasses? But molasses is the base ingredient for rum, and rum production is a major industry in New England. Distilleries employ workers, create trade goods, generate profit. The tax makes rum more expensive to produce, cutting into margins, threatening businesses. The Stamp Act of 1765 goes further. It requires that many printed materials in the colonies, legal documents, newspapers, even playing cards, carry a tax stamp purchased from British officials. This affects almost everyone. The lawyer drawing up a land deed needs stamped paper. The merchant printing advertisements need stamped paper. The newspaper printer needs stamped paper. The colonial objection isn't primarily about the amount of tax, though the amounts matter. It's about the principle. These taxes are imposed by the British Parliament, where colonists have no representatives. The colonist argument is simple. British subjects have historically had the right to consent to their own taxation through representatives they elect. Parliament is taxing colonists who elect no members of Parliament. This violates rights that British subjects are supposed to possess. No taxation without representation becomes the rallying cry. It's both a constitutional argument and a practical grievance. The constitutional argument says that taxation without representation is tyranny. The practical grievance says that people living in America understand American economic conditions better than officials in London, and that policies made in London often ignore American realities. The Stamp Act is repealed in 1766 after massive colonial protests and boycotts of British goods, but it's replaced with the Townend Acts in 1767, which imposed taxes on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea imported into the colonies. Different products, same principle, Parliament taxing colonists without their consent. The colonial response developed sophistication. Women organized boycotts of British goods, making do with domestic substitutes. Homespun cloth becomes a political statement. Wearing imported British fabric marks you as unpatriotic. Wearing rough colonial-made cloth shows your commitment to American rights. This is where the daily skills we've been observing become politically significant. The same women who've been spinning thread and weaving cloth out of necessity now ramp up production deliberately. They're proving a point. We can provide for ourselves. We don't need British manufactured goods as much as you think we do. Men organize non-importation agreements. Merchants in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia agree collectively to stop importing British goods until the taxes are repealed. This is economic warfare. They're trying to hurt British manufacturers and merchants enough that those groups will pressure Parliament to change policy, and it works partially. The Townend Acts are mostly repealed in 1770, but the tax on tea remains, kept deliberately, as a symbol that Parliament retains the right to tax the colonies. The issue simmers for 3 years. Then in 1773, Parliament passes the Tea Act. This isn't technically a new tax. It actually reduces the price of British tea by eliminating certain duties and giving the British East India Company a monopoly on colonial tea sales. But colonists see it as a trick. Accept this cheaper tea, and you're implicitly accepting Parliament's right to tax without representation. The response is the Boston Tea. Every party. In December 1773, colonial activists disguised as Mohawk Indians board British ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342-pound chests of tea into the water. 90,000 of tea worth about 10,000 British pounds, roughly $1 million in modern money, destroyed in a single night. Britain's response is punitive. The coercive acts of 1774, called the Intolerable Acts by colonists, close Boston Harbor until the destroyed tea is paid for. They revoke Massachusetts' colonial charter, eliminating local self-government. They allow British officials accused of crimes to be tried in Britain rather than in the colonies. They require colonists to house British soldiers in their homes. These measures are designed to isolate Massachusetts and intimidate other colonies into compliance. Instead, they create solidarity. Other colonies send food and supplies to Massachusetts. The Continental Congress convenes in Philadelphia in September 1774, bringing together representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies to coordinate response. The slide toward armed conflict accelerates. Colonial militias begin drilling more regularly. They stockpile weapons and ammunition. Town meetings become increasingly radical in their rhetoric. Loyalists, colonists who still support British authority, find themselves pressured, sometimes violently, to either change their views or leave. In April 1775, British troops march from Boston to Concord to seize colonial military supplies. The militia confronts them at Lexington Green. Someone fires. No one knows who, though. Both sides later blame the other. More shots follow. 8 militia men die. The British push onto Concord, destroy some supplies, then begin the march back to Boston. But the countryside has mobilized. Militia from surrounding towns converge on the road. They fire from behind trees, stone walls, and buildings. The British retreat becomes a running battle. By the time the British troops reach the safety of Boston, they've suffered nearly 300 casualties. The Americans have lost fewer than 100. This isn't how European warfare works. European armies fight in open fields in formation, with strict rules of engagement. The American militia fights like guerrillas using terrain, mobility, and local knowledge to compensate for their lack of formal military training. And here's where the colonial experience we've been observing becomes militarily relevant. These militiamen are farmers, blacksmiths, carpenters, men who've spent their lives solving practical problems, working with their hands, enduring hardship. They know the local terrain intimately. They're used to long marches carrying heavy loads. They're comfortable with discomfort. They're also used to self-organization. A barn raising requires coordinating dozens of men with different skills toward a common goal without formal hierarchy. A town meeting requires debate, compromise, and collective decision. Yet, these experiences create a culture where ordinary men feel capable of organizing themselves for action. The British troops are professional soldiers, better trained, better equipped, better disciplined, but they're also far from home, dependent on supply lines that stretch across the Atlantic, unfamiliar with the terrain, and increasingly isolated in a hostile population. The Continental Congress reconvenes in May 1775 and takes the dramatic step of creating a Continental Army with George Washington as commander. The transition from colonial militia to an actual army is difficult. Militia are used to serving for short periods, then going home to their farms. The Continental Army needs men who will stay for longer terms. The enlistments are measured in months or years, not weeks. The conditions at Valley Forge in the winter of 1777 to 1778 test everything these men have learned about survival. The army camps in Pennsylvania with inadequate food, inadequate clothing, inadequate shelter. Men sleep in rough log huts with minimal insulation. Many lack proper shoes. They wrap their feet in rags and leave bloody footprints in the snow. Disease kills more men than the British do. Typhus, typhoid fever, dysentery, and pneumonia spread through the crowded, unsanitary camp. Of the 12,000 men who enter Valley Forge, about 2,000 die during that winter, not from battle, from cold, hunger, and disease. But here's the thing, 10,000 survive. 10,000 men endure conditions that would kill modern soldiers. They endure because they've spent their lives enduring. They know how to survive on minimal food. They know how to stay alive in the cold. They know how to cope with discomfort that modern people can barely imagine. And they stay because they believe in what they're fighting for. This is the crucial element. They're not conscripts forced into service. They are re-volunteers, men who've chosen to risk their lives for a cause. That cause is framed in the Declaration of Independence, written in July 1776, which transforms a rebellion over taxes into a revolutionary statement about human rights. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The irony of slaveholders writing about equality and liberty isn't lost on everyone, even at the time. Some people, including enslaved people themselves, point out the contradiction. But the words create a standard against which America can be judged. A standard that will eventually be used to challenge slavery, though that won't happen for nearly another century. For now, the revolution continues. The war drags on for years. Battles won and lost, territory gained and surrendered, moments of hope and moments of despair. The Americans have advantages, fighting on their own territory, local support, leadership that understands guerrilla tactics. The British have advantages, professional army, naval superiority, more resources. What tips the balances? French intervention, France, still bitter about losing the 7 Years' War to Britain, sees an opportunity to weaken its rival. French money, French weapons, and eventually French troops and French naval power turn the tide. The decisive battle at Yorktown in 1781 succeeds partly because a French fleet prevents British ships from evacuating or reinforcing their troops. When Cornwallis surrenders at Yorktown in October 1781, it effectively ends the war, though the formal peace treaty won't be signed until 1783. The colonies have won. Against enormous odds, a collection of farmers and merchants and craftsmen have defeated the most powerful military in the world. Why did they win? The standard answer emphasizes French help, British strategic mistakes, and American determination. But there's something deeper. The colonial experience itself prepared Americans for this fight. Self-reliance wasn't just a virtue. It was a survival skill developed through generations of building houses, growing food, making tools, and solving problems without outside help. When the Continental Army ran short of supplies, soldiers improvised. When traditional tactics didn't work, they adapted. When formal authority was absent, they organized themselves. The community cooperation that helped families survive winters became military cohesion that held units together through brutal conditions. The barn-raising mentality, everyone contributing to a shared project, transferred to military logistics, to building fortifications, to creating supply networks. The experience of local self-government in town meetings and colonial assemblies created our political culture, where ordinary people felt entitled to have opinions about how they should be governed. This isn't universal in human history. In most societies through most of history, those ordinary people accept that their rulers are simply better than them, smarter, more capable, chosen by God or birth to lead. But colonial Americans had spent generations governing themselves at the local level. They elected selectmen who managed town affairs. They voted on town budgets. They debated policy in public meetings. This created a sense that government should be answerable to the government, not the other way around. When British policy conflicted with what colonists thought was right, they didn't just accept it. They argued back. They organized resistance. They eventually took up arms. This wasn't inevitable. Plenty of colonial subjects in other parts of the world accepted imperial authority, but the particular combination of self-reliance, local self-government, and economic independence that characterized the American colonies created a culture prepared to fight for independence. The victory in the Revolutionary War doesn't immediately solve all problems. The new nation has to figure out how to govern itself. The Articles of Confederation, the first attempt at creating a national government, prove inadequate. A constitutional convention in 1787 produces a new framework that balances state and federal power, creates a system of checks and balances, and establishes representative government with elected leaders. The Constitution is a compromise document, leaving many issues unresolved. Slavery is the most glaring one. The Constitution protects it without directly naming it, counting enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for representation purposes, while denying them any rights. This compromise will eventually lead to civil war. But the Constitution also establishes principles that can be expanded over time. The idea that government derives its power from consent of the governed. The idea that rights are inherent, not granted by government. The idea that power should be distributed and limited rather than concentrated in a monarch or aristocracy. These ideas emerged directly from colonial experience. People who had spent generations governing themselves locally, solving their own problems, creating their own institutions, weren't willing to accept authoritarian rule from across the ocean or anywhere else. The sun is setting now over the landscape we've been observing. The fields that were wilderness a century ago are now farms. The stumps are mostly rotted away. The houses are more substantial. Some have glass windows now. Some have wooden floors instead of packed earth. The communities are established, prosperous by the standards of their time. The people walking these roads, working these fields, tending these fires, have built something remarkable. They've created a society from raw materials and determination. They've survived winters that tested their systems to the breaking point. They've built networks of trade and cooperation that function across distances and differences. And they've created a new nation based on principles that were radical for their time and remain challenging even now. The idea that ordinary people can govern themselves, that rights belong to individuals, not just to aristocrats or kings. Third, that government should serve the people rather than the people serving the government. The gap between these ideals and the reality is enormous. Women can't vote. Enslaved people have no rights at all. Native Americans are being pushed off their lands. The promise of equality is extended to only a small fraction of the population. But the ideals exist, written down, established as standards. Over the next 2.5 centuries, people who are excluded from that initial promise will use the language of the Declaration and the Constitution to demand inclusion. Women will cite these documents in fighting for suffrage. Abolitionists will use them to argue against slavery. Civil rights activists will invoke them in challenging segregation. The colonial experience created more than just a nation. It created a set of assumptions about human capability and human rights that continue to shape American culture. The belief that problems can be solved through practical application of intelligence and effort. The belief that communities function best when people cooperate voluntarily rather than being forced into cooperation. The belief that ordinary people possess dignity and deserve respect. These beliefs emerge directly from the experiences we've been observing. When you've built a house with your own hands, grown food through your own labor, and survived winter through your own planning, you develop confidence in your own capabilities. When your survival has depended on community cooperation, you understand the value of mutual aid and voluntary association. When you've participated in town meetings and seen ordinary people debate and decide important issues, you believe in democratic governance. Not everyone in colonial America experienced these things equally. Enslaved people built houses and grew food, but never benefited from their own labor. Women worked as hard as men, but had fewer legal rights and less political power. Native Americans watched as their lands were taken and their populations devastated by disease and violence. The colonial achievement is real, but incomplete. It's impressive, but morally compromised. UN. Understanding it requires holding both truths simultaneously, acknowledging both what was accomplished and what was denied. Both the intelligence of the systems and the injustice of their distributions. As full darkness falls and families gather around their fires one more time, we can see them more clearly now. These aren't simple people living simple lives. They're complex human beings navigating difficult circumstances, making choices with limited options, building systems that solve some problems while creating others. They're not heroes or villains. They're people doing what people do, trying to survive, trying to provide for their families, trying to create meaning and community and stability in an uncertain world. The skills they developed, practical problem-solving, endurance in the face of hardship, community cooperation, democratic decision, become part of American culture. Not universally, not perfectly, but persistently. These skills and values get passed down through generations, shaping how Americans approach challenges even today. When modern Americans face problems, the instinct is often to roll up our sleeves and try to fix things ourselves, rather than waiting for authority figures to solve problems for us. When communities face disasters, neighbors help each other before official relief arrives. When institutions fail to serve people's needs, there's a tendency to create new institutions rather than just accepting failure. These patterns of behavior have roots in colonial experience. They're the legacy of people who had to solve their own problems because no one else would solve them, who had to help each other because there was no social safety net, who had to govern themselves because distant authorities didn't understand or care about local conditions. The physical world the colonist built is mostly gone now. The hole and daub houses have crumbled. The wooden tools have rotted. The cloth woven on hand looms has worn to nothing. But the mental habits they developed, the social patterns they established, the political ideas they fought for, these persist. Understanding colonial life means understanding where we come from, not just genealogically. Most Americans descend from people who arrived long after the colonial period, but culturally. The assumptions that shape American culture, for better and worse, were forged during the colonial period, ioded by people living the lives we've been observing. Their world was harder than ours in almost every measurable way. They worked longer hours, died younger, experienced more physical pain, lost more children, lived with more uncertainty. Modern life, and with its comfort and convenience and safety, is objectively better by almost any standard you might apply. But they knew things we've forgotten. How to create from raw materials. How to maintain complex systems without external support. How to find joy in simple pleasures. How to endure hardship without despair. How to build community through shared struggle. There's something worth preserving in that knowledge. Something worth remembering even as we're grateful we don't have to live that way anymore. The recognition that humans are capable of remarkable things when necessity demands it. That communities can function through voluntary cooperation, that ordinary people possess extraordinary resilience. As you drift towards sleep, imagine one more time that colonial house with its dying fire, the family sleeping on their rope beds, them breathing the smoke-tinged air, surrounded by darkness broken only by glowing embers. They'll wake tomorrow and do it all again. The endless work of survival, the constant maintenance of systems, the daily choices that accumulate into a life. They'll face another day without any of the comforts you take for granted. No electricity, no running water, no modern medicine, no easy answers, just their hands and their minds, and their community, and whatever strength they can summon to keep going. And they will keep going, because they always have, because stopping means failure, and failure means death, because they've built systems that work, and they'll maintain those systems through competence and determination and mutual support. This is what it meant to be alive in colonial America. This is what it took to survive them. This is what they accomplished, and this is what they created. Not a perfect society, far from it. Not even a just society by modern standards, but a functioning society built from wilderness by people who refused to give up. And in building that society, they built something else too. They built the foundation for a nation that would struggle with its contradictions for centuries. A nation that promised more than it delivered, but kept the promise alive long enough for excluded people to claim it. A nation shaped by self-reliance and community cooperation, by practical problem-solving and democratic ideals, by the daily experiences of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Sleep well. The fire is banked, the doors are latched, the family is safe for another night. Tomorrow brings more work, more challenges, more opportunities to prove that humans can thrive even in difficult circumstances. Tomorrow, but for now, rest. Let the sounds of a colonial night, the settling of timbers, the crackle of dying embers, the quiet breathing of sleeping people carry you into peaceful sleep. You've walked in their shoes, you've seen their world, you've understood their struggles and their successes. And perhaps in understanding them, you've learned something about what humans are capable of when challenged, about what matters when you strip away modern conveniences, about what endures when everything else is stripped away. Good night, sleep well, and remember,